Hello, I'm Monika Wahi, and welcome to my lecture, How Not to Plagiarize in Nursing. Learning objectives. At the end of this lecture, the learner should be able to state the difference between quoting and paraphrasing, state the difference between an in-text citation and a reference list, explain what APA format means with respect to in-text citation and references, and state one reason why it is important for your in-text citations and references to be accurate. The reason I made this video is I realized that there are a lot of nursing students who understand that plagiarism is bad and that you shouldn't do it, but do not actually understand the details of what actually plagiarism is. So in this lecture, I'm going to explain to you the language of plagiarism and how to avoid it. First, I'm going to explain what we mean by sources, and then how you reference these sources when you write. One way you do it is quoting, and the other way you do it is paraphrasing. And I'm going to explain how to do that without plagiarizing. In order to really understand that, you have to, as a nurse, you have to also understand the concept of APA format and what that all means, what in-text citations are, and what references are. So I also cover that. Let's start with source. So what is a source? It's anything that has facts that are used in your writing. So I'm speaking specifically about when you're writing essays in college, or if you're writing peer-reviewed literature. You will use sources. You will probably use scientific sources, but you will use all different kinds of sources, like newspapers, or blogs, or books, or lectures, even interviews, conferences. But here's the thing, even you are a source of opinions and expertise. And the idea is that if you do not reference your sources that are not you when you're writing, people assume that you're the source. So that's what plagiarism is. It's when you use information from a source in your writing, but you do not cite the source, which means you take someone else's ideas and you say them in your writing, but you don't say where they came from. And if you don't say where they came from and they didn't come from you, because you're writing it, everyone assumes it's from you, and that's where the plagiarism comes in. What are the consequences of plagiarism? Well, you can end up on Time magazine. That's what happened to Senator John Walsh. So you will see that he plagiarized his final paper for his master's degree. And if you read more about this, you will find what he did was he copied a few paragraphs word for word from actually kind of famous military document. He was at the Army War College. And it was found that he plagiarized, and specifically what he had done was copy these things word for word and not cite the source. So we're going to talk about how not to plagiarize in nursing. So what are the two ways that we can talk about our sources without plagiarizing? Those two ways are called quote and paraphrase. And I'm going to talk about them together right now. Then I'm going to talk about quote specifically, and then I'm going to talk about paraphrase specifically. But the reason why I wanted to introduce them to you together is I actually wanted to make sure you understand what's at the bottom of the slide in red. First of all, regardless of whether you use quote or paraphrase, you need an in-text citation. Senator Walsh did not have that at all. Okay, so you always need to have this in-text citation to say what your source is. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about when I say in-text citation, just hold on a second. I'll get to what that is. Okay? The second thing in red is you'll notice on the right side, paraphrase, that's most of your report. So most of your report or your essay is going to consist of you reporting facts in the form of paraphrase from your sources with a bunch of in-text citations. A smaller part is you going to be stating your opinion, which is there's no sources, that's just you, that's fine. And an even smaller part is going to be what's on the left side of the slide, this quote. And some of my students just love quoting. So I say, well, limit it to one per paragraph and make it short. But really, you can write a whole essay without any quotes and you're just fine. You just mainly use paraphrasing. The difference between quotes and paraphrase is quote is an exact copy of the words in the article. And when you do that, you have to put quote marks around it. So we do this when we talk. We'll say, she said she'd be quote unquote late, and if somebody who says that has a reputation of being really late, then that quote unquote kind of implies that. Well, you're literally doing that, quote unquote. I mean, she didn't say she'd be a little tardy, right? She said she'd be late. So that's why you say quote unquote. And this is just like the essay version of doing that. But most of the time, what you actually do is you read the article or a lot of articles, a lot of sources, and you pick out facts from different ones and you put the facts together your own way, and that is paraphrase. And that, of course, has no quote marks around it because you're just quoting yourself. So that's fine, no quote marks. But again, an in-text citation. Quoting actually isn't as easy as it sounds. So, for example, if Senator Walsh had put quote marks around all of the words he had copied in his thesis and put an in-text citation, the good news is he wouldn't have plagiarized. But the bad news is the reason why he probably didn't do that is his thesis advisor would have said, hey, you shouldn't be quoting this big long thing. You should just take a little piece of it that's important and quote that and paraphrase the rest. And so what you'll see is when people straight up plagiarize, like Senator Walsh did, a lot of times they're just lazy. They're just copying, pasting somebody else's work, not bothering to say the source and not bothering to paraphrase it. Even when you quote from a source like we're going to do right now, you have to think about it. So I pulled this newspaper article from CBS Philly, and it was about a measles outbreak. And the Secretary of Health, Michael Wolff, in Pennsylvania said this. He said, based on initial information received from those involved in the treatment of the individual and based on the initial investigation by the department, it was believed that this was likely a case of measles, and public notification was made out of an abundance of caution. Measles is a highly contagious disease, and there is a small window of time after exposure to receive the measles, mumps, and rubella (MMR) vaccine or immunoglobulin for those who have not been vaccinated. So, as you can imagine, that's like way too long. But you probably noticed when I read that you started to fall asleep, but you woke up at the phrase abundance of caution. It's just a really nice phrase. So, if you were going to quote from this, well, if I was going to quote from this, I would say take out that juicy part and quote that. So now when I'm writing my essay, I'd shorten this gentleman's name to just his title. The Pennsylvania Secretary of Health said, it was believed that this was likely a case of measles, and public notification was made out of an abundance of caution. He said it so nicely we put it in, but if he hadn't said something so eloquent, we could have just paraphrased. And that is how you have to think about quoting. Try to make it short and try to make it juicy. If you choose to quote a long quote but just leave out a piece in the middle, like if you remember when I read it, I started with based on initial information received, and then there was a bunch of stuff, and then this part it was believed. All you do is remove that and put 3 periods. That's a secret code from you to the reader that you remove something in the middle of the quote and that there's something there and they have to go to the source if they want to see the whole thing. Also, sometimes you need to add your own words to a quote because you're taking it out of context and it doesn't make sense unless you clarify things. And you do that by adding your own words in brackets. So where I see that when I'm writing is sometimes if I'm quoting somebody with a lot of pronouns in their quote, I have to explain to the reader who I'm talking about. So imagine this sentence. The professor told her she would not be accepted in the class. Well, we don't know who she, her is. So if I were quoting that, I might say the professor said to her, Sally, that she, Susie, would not be accepted in the class. And then you can tell that Sally and Susie are different people because I put their name in brackets. Enough about quoting. We don't do it very much, so we really should focus on paraphrasing because that's what we mainly do when we talk about our sources when we're writing an essay. So I'll just give you an actual quote from an actual article. It said, the CDC did not immediately respond to questions on Thursday about whether it would start recommending Trumenba for all adolescents or just for use in locations where a meningitis outbreak is occurring. As you can see, as an epidemiologist, I just love to talk about vaccines and outbreaks. Trumenba is a new meningitis vaccine. What's not said in this quote is that there are 2 other meningitis vaccines that are already given to people, and this Trumenba was new. And what was important about this little factlet here was that the CDC hadn't made any recommendations for it yet. But the student was writing an essay about the whole thing, about the whole vaccine meningitis thing. So that student had already had a source that talked about the other two vaccines, but wanted to add the piece about Trumenba not having any recommendations yet. So you'll see in the essay, the last part of the sentence says the CDC had not yet made recommendations for the new vaccine. That was a paraphrase of the fact in the upper part. So I don't show it on the slide, but both of these would need an in-text citation. But I just wanted to show you how you go about paraphrasing with a little example. Now I want to just remind you that if you do take an exact copy of the words, but you don't put quote marks around them, but you do put an in-text citation, it is still plagiarism. If you are too lazy to paraphrase, basically, and too dishonest to put quotes around the actual words that are not yours, it's still plagiarism, and that's cheating. So if you feel lazy and you want to quote everything, go ahead and put quote marks around it, okay, and add your source. It's just that expect the teacher will say, hey, you need to shorten this up and paraphrase. So now we get to the really exciting part of this presentation, because I've been talking about in-text citations, but I haven't told you what they are. Well, they kind of are literally what they call themselves, which is they are citations in the text. So citation is like a little key to a legend. And that legend is the reference list. That comes at the end of the paper. Now, in high school, often we will write papers with a lot of sources, and we'll just put a bibliography of what sources we use, but we won't use these in-text citations because it's high school. But when you get into college and above, you always need to actually say in the text which source you're using. And if you actually have a bunch of sources that you're going to list in your reference list that say the same fact, you have to list all of them in the in-text citation after the fact. So these are citations in the text after a fact that then key you to a later reference list so you can look up details about the source. That way you can see as you're reading kind of who said this, and you can stop your reading and go look up the reference and actually look up the source. That's why all of this has to be accurate, because if you're saying the source said that, somebody might read it and go read that source, and if they didn't actually say that, that's a problem. So here is an example on the left side of the slide of some in-text citations I was just showing you at the top, and then also a reference list, not the one that matches this one. But the reason why I wanted to show you that is in nursing we use APA format, which I'll get into in a second, and in that format the in-text citations are words. They're the author's last names and years, and the references also are words, like they start with the first author's last name, as you can see below. But in other formats that are not APA format, sometimes the in-text citations are numbers. So they're like where you would see this Maggie and Ciso in 2014 right now, you'd see like 1 or 2 or 7. And then you'd go to the reference list, and instead of seeing Lovett and Richardson like you see there, you'd see 1 and then Lovett, blah, 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 and then 2, Richardson, blah, blah, blah. And so those are not APA format. So APA format, which is used in nursing, uses the author's last names and years in the in-text citations, and then in the reference list there's no real number, they're not numbered. It's just alphabetized by the first author's last name. So why do we even use APA format in nursing? And even what is it? So APA stands for American Psychological Association. So you might be familiar, that's the big association for psychology. But they got their act together early, and they came up with this format a long time ago, and this format has been adopted not only by them, but by nursing, psychology, and anything in the social sciences. Now, this is ironic that nursing has adopted this, because other formats that are used in medicine are the numbery kind, like the JAMA format and the Vancouver format. And then if you actually look at these scientific journals that are not nursing journals, they're other kinds of journals, they will have sometimes custom formats. If you've studied literature or been in like maybe a history class where you're writing essays, those places tend to use MLA, Modern Language Association, as their format, which is a little bit more like APA, where you're using authors' last names. But just as a big picture, the format specifies how to correctly write and punctuate the in-text citations and the reference lists. It's just instructions of how to do that. And since you're in nursing, you're going to always use APA formats, so that's what I concentrate on here. So how do you actually apply APA format? And it's really hard and people really get into it, but as a general approach, this is what you do. You do 3 steps. You first classify your source. You decide, what kind of source do I have? Do I have a newspaper article or like a journal article or like a conference paper or a book or a blog post or, like I was saying, an interview or some other situation? Figure out what you have, because that's what you're going to look up the format on. So you go look up an example then of a correctly formatted in-text citation and reference for a source like yours. So if you find a conference paper that you want to reference, you look up an example of a properly formatted APA reference for a conference paper, and you do the same thing. And basically what you do is step 3 is you copy the examples, punctuation, and style, and you put in your own sources information. So like, for instance, however they say the date, you look up your own source and you say the date their way. So how do you find accurate examples of APA citations for your classified sources? Well, look no further than the OWL. Just hoot out for the Purdue OWL. So if you go look for the Purdue OWL, you will find it. Purdue Online Writing Lab from Purdue University, which I don't work there. I'm just so happy they put up this page. It is so helpful for both professors and students. They have a whole MLA section. And then, of course, I'm going to concentrate on the APA section. So go click on that. And here we are at the Online Writing Lab, the APA section. So if you look on the left, here are, like, for instance, if you wanted to reference a book, you could click on here and get coaching and examples that you could change, you know, keeping the punctuation and all that. And I'm going to actually give you a little example of how I do it. I use Google Scholar here, which is scholar.google.com. And I was writing a paper and I needed information about how burnout in nurses affects patient safety. So I did a search and I found this conference paper here. So I clicked on it and I said, this is a really good conference paper. I should probably reference it, but how do I do that? So I went over to the OWL and I realized I looked under other print sources, right? And so I got to this page and I started going down and I noticed at the bottom it said conference proceedings. Okay, so what I would be doing in my reference list is I would literally copy this whole thing, copy and paste it in. And then see how it says 1995 here? Over here, this is the real one. I would put this 2015. And here I'd say from the first international conference, blah, blah, blah. This would be from Sigma Theta Tau International 43rd biannual convention. So that's what you do, is you just change out each piece, and where you get that is from this online writing lab. There are other places to look, especially even just the APA webpage. However, I've just found this one to be a really good source of information because it gives you examples and it sort of coaches you through the examples as to what is important about them. Now, I just showed you a little demonstration of how I use Google Scholar to find peer-reviewed articles. If you want to really know about how to do that, you have to watch my other video on it. And also, I teach how to find objective news articles using Google News, especially on health topics. So you'll have to watch that video if you want to know how to do that. But what this video is about is that citing and referencing sources. And so the point I wanted to make with that last demonstration is how you classify a source changes how you reference it. So if you are saying you think you have a newspaper article, in the reference you're going to put the exact date it was published. But if you're wrong and you really have a journal article, then you're doing it wrong because journal articles don't have the exact date. So that's why classifying your source is so important to getting your APA reference right. So here are just some overarching APA style tips. Try to use this copy, paste, change method, but again, get the right kind of source or it won't look right. Also, some specific tips for newspaper articles and online articles. But this first tip is like, do not spell out first names ever of authors. That's the truth. Like, they don't put your first, it doesn't matter how beautiful your first name is, you're never going to see it as an author, okay, in APA style. you want to italicize a newspaper name in the reference list. So if you're referencing the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, make sure the newspaper name is in there and is italicized. Always be cognizant of not capitalizing all words in the title, just the first and the proper nouns. So if there was an article that was like President Obama visits a school, then a school would not be uppercase. But if it's President Obama visits, Henry Sibley High School, then you would capitalize that because that's a proper noun. So just make sure you don't make that mistake. And also, regardless of actually your source, you want to make sure you have all the elements of the date in the correct order. The reason why this is a problem in newspapers especially is because you do it out to the day. It's not just the year. So really pay attention to that. And when you are citing in-text citations, usually when you're citing newspapers articles and online articles like blogs, there's only one author, and therefore you really only have one author's name in the in-text citation. If there's more than one author, there are pretty complicated rules for how that in-text citation looks. And so you'll want to go to the OWL and take a look at what they suggest for having many authors to a work when you're doing the in-text citation. So because I was just giving an example of newspaper articles, I just wanted to give you an example on the slide of common mistakes made when referencing newspaper articles. And so I picked one from the Huffington Post, which is a blog, right? So that's not actually a newspaper. But still, it uses the same reference format. So I thought I'd just go over it. You'll see at the top of the slide it's correct. What's wrong with what's at the bottom? Well, first of all, like I said, never spell out first names, even though Dina's a lovely name. You don't get to say it. Just D period. Notice on the correct one that 2012 comes first and then there's a comma and it's December 13th. Don't make that mistake when referencing a newspaper. Make sure that the date's in the right order. And then the thing I was talking about, don't capitalize every word in the title. You'll see that where it's correct, where the words are capitalized in the title, and where it's incorrect, where people commonly make a mistake. Then also, like I was saying, make sure you italicize the source as it's correctly done on the upper part and not correctly done on the lower part. So I have given you all the tools for citing and referencing sources, so you do not need to plagiarize. You now know how to quote and paraphrase. You now know how to use APA format for in-text citations and references. So to cite a source in APA format, first classify it, then look up similar examples for guidance as to the correct in-text citation and reference format and put it in. And as long as you always do that when you're reporting information from the source, you will not plagiarize in nursing. So thanks for watching this video and spread the word.